now, come, eat, eat. The food is from the king's very own table.
Melzar, we must have the meat and wine removed.
What?
Daniel, very famous prophet. Everybody knows Daniel. Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel interpreting the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Him and his three friends refusing the king's meat. And of course, in the book of Daniel, we also have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. All very famous stories. And the later chapters, his great visions. A lot of Christian theories about the last days are based in Daniel's writings. So who was Daniel? What do we know about him? We actually know a little bit about this guy. For instance, we know he was part of the first wave of captives taken to Babylon. Now, the Babylonian captivity happened in 3 stages, or 3 waves. The first one occurred in the 3rd or 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah. Babylon came in, they conquered, they took a lot of captives back to Babylon. That's the first wave. And Daniel is taken in this first wave, as he himself records in the first chapter, first verse of his book that he wrote. So we know he's part of this very first wave of captives. Now, according to his own writing again, Nebuchadnezzar had the sons of the princes and the nobles of Judah brought in to be taught in the court of the king, which means that Daniel was of the princes, of the nobility, of the ruling class of Judah. So he was no peasant, he was no farm boy, probably lived in Jerusalem growing up, and he was of the noble families. He was probably, if not related to the king, he knew the king. He was an acquaintance of the royal family, at the very least. He is then shipped off to Babylon. And he is, we know the story, he is taught in the king's court, shows his wisdom, he interprets the king's dreams, a couple of them. We have the story of his 3 friends. But then what happened? Well, Daniel actually lives a long time, because he came out of Judah in this first wave. This would be approximately 608 BC, approximately. But he's thrown into the lion's den after Persia conquers Babylon. And that is in the year 540, approximately, around there. We've got about a 70-year stretch from when we were first introduced to him, and he wasn't a child. He wasn't born in 608. That's when he is taken into Babylon. So he is a young man, probably a teenager. I would assume 15 or 16 when he is taken into Babylon. And that is when he refuses the king's meat. That's when he's a teenager. He interprets the dream of the statue and the stone cut out without hands when he's 16, 17 years old. He is made a magistrate in the government of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, he is a top advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. He is in the king's court for the rest of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar, he conquers Judah in the 1st or 2nd year of his reign. So by the 4th year of his reign, Daniel is his top advisor. And he remains in that position all the life of Nebuchadnezzar. It is in the time of his son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Balthazar, that Persia conquers. Actually, I think Balthazar might be Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. But Persia conquers, and we have the writing, the finger writing on the wall, that whole story. And it is in the reign of Persia, 70 years later. And it is sometime after that Daniel dies. So Daniel lives probably about 90 years. He's about 90 years old when he dies. That's a rough estimate. And in all that time, from the time that he's 16 until his death, he is a government official. He is a magistrate for the Babylonians and then for the Persians. So Daniel is the prophet to foreign kings. He has dealings with at least 3 that we know. And throughout that whole time, he stays faithful to God. He never once wavers, which is the big lesson of the history of Daniel. Now, we do also have his great visions that he had, some of the greatest visions. So Daniel has prophecies and visions that really tell us the history of the world from the rise of Babylon to the millennium. And many other prophets make reference to Daniel's writings. Christ mentions Daniel's writings in Matthew when he is talking about the last days. Matthew chapter 25, I believe, 24. Matthew 24, great discourse on the last days. He talks about the desolation of abomination that Daniel spoke of. The beasts that John the Revelator mentions in Revelation are based on the beasts that Daniel sees in his visions. Daniel had some of the greatest visions recorded in Scripture. But he was a man that lived most of his life in captivity, but as a magistrate in the government of kings. in all the figures of Scripture. Solomon was most famous for his wisdom, but I think Daniel comes second. And as a master of dreams, as an interpreter of dreams, the only greater man is Joseph of Egypt. Daniel is a great man. My favorite reference to Daniel in all the Bible outside his own book is in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel says that even if Noah or Daniel had been here, they would only save themselves and the rest of Jerusalem would be destroyed. Even their righteousness would not be enough to save the city. Think about that. Daniel and Noah are the two examples. Now, I would be remiss if I don't mention that some scholars think that this reference to Daniel and Ezekiel doesn't reference the Daniel of the book of Daniel, but references a different Daniel farther back in history, a legendary figure of Jewish folklore, who they can't really find evidence for in any other writing. They just don't think it's referencing Daniel. The reason they don't think it's referencing the book of Daniel is because they think the book of Daniel was written like 300 years later. They don't think it is an authentic book. They think it was written down about 300 years after the fact. And if you take that view, then Ezekiel can't be referring to the book of Daniel, the Daniel of that book. But that's just scholars. We know better because we have God. We have the prophets to tell us the truth. And they have testified that Daniel, he was a real man, he was a real prophet, he lived, he served in the court of kings, and we have his words.